to welcome you to this distinguished lecture, to the Bachofen lecture of 2019. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Amanda Hammar, who will deliver this lecture this year. And of course, as every year, you can read that lecture after a couple of months because it will be printed. It will also be online. It's open access publication at our website. I would like to say a few words on Amanda. When we invited her to deliver the lecture, she was very scared because she says that she is not a real anthropologist and that she has a chair for development studies and not for anthropology. African studies, yes. And that is something that she feels might be an obstacle to deliver such a lecture. But as everybody knows, anthropology has been very successful in exporting its methods, and I would say that not only African studies, but also other disciplines like history, like sociology, like political science have learned a lot from anthropology, and therefore we are now profiting from the fact that we have exported the methods and now are getting back from what these interchanges and these relationships have brought to the discipline. So we are very confident that we'll learn a lot from people who claim that they are not anthropologists. And that is also something that brings me to what Amanda is working on. To some extent you will hear that a little later today. But she is not only from Zimbabwe, but she also works on Zimbabwe. And she is addressing a subject that some of us here in the room have explored themselves for a couple of years already. So the relationship between land and property, for instance, which is a key issue in many African countries, as everybody knows, but also the relationship between resettlement and belonging to some extent, and also what it means to the people who try to face a better future when they have been resettled, and whether that becomes true or not. So it's also about the political dimension of it. And it's also about the imaginative dimension of it. So how you plan your future and how that is related to your trajectory through life and also through the different spaces that exists in contemporary Africa. Political spaces, social spaces, and also cultural spaces. The lecture today is, as you can already see on the screen, about speaking through houses. And since we are cooperating with critical urbanisms here, we are sometimes taught that houses speak and not through houses. But I feel that this sort of formulating the problem is much closer to anthropology than what architects tell us, that the houses are speaking themselves. So we are keen to learn more from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. So thank you very much to Till, to Rita, to Nina, Nora, and Francesca, who are all being very welcoming and helpful. And it's a great honor and excitement. I have to shift from anxiety to excitement, so I'll go with the excitement. And as you said, there's the notion of speaking through houses, but also, within that, I would definitely say houses speaking as well. So we'll come back a little bit to that, so the combination. And because I want to keep a little bit sort of focused, I'm going to probably read a lot of this, so forgive me for not just talking directly to you all the time. So, I'll start with it. In this lecture, I will be speaking through houses, as the title suggests, as well as listening to, or perhaps rather translating to some extent, what houses themselves say, as a way of thinking about the co-constitutive relationship between property and personhood. So clearly, houses, like any buildings, while seemingly solid, are a constantly changing composite generated through a dynamic articulation between material, social, symbolic, corporeal, and emotional elements. They speak in multiple languages. So they speak through the actual sounds they generate, maybe a creaking door, maybe rain against the window, laughter, music. They speak through the scents, the smells, food cooking, damp walls, fresh laundry. They speak through the objects they contain and display, photographs on a wall, dead flowers in a cracked vase. They speak through shifts in light and dark, the changing times of day, maybe a bare light bulb, maybe a paraffin lamp that lights the room. Through the varied movements and energies of bodies in daily activity, as well as through absences, as well as through memories verbalized or merely felt. So, houses also speak of wider structures and processes, and their effects on the biographical lives of and in houses. And this is something I'll come back to all the time, the sort of the immediate, the intimate, and the bigger structural. To me, these are ongoing, interrelated aspects of buildings, of houses. Wider structures and processes, contextual as they are, with very real effects, might include colonial and post-colonial urban planning policies, for example, trends in economic growth or the decline in labour possibilities, political economies of class and of property ownership, the nature of political regimes themselves, the cultural politics of identity, belonging and exclusion, and gendered patterns and possibilities of citizenship. So these wider framings that really have effects and meaning and real effects on the nature of people's relationships to property and to themselves. So a single house is never an island in either time or space. It's always multiply located in relation to a specific physical place and to broader social space, to both linear chronological time and the uneven temporalities of life as a whole. As such, a house is always in conversation, literally and metaphorically, with so much more and so many more than just itself and its most immediate occupants. So in preparing for the lecture, I have tried to reflect beyond some of the more abstract questions about how property and personhood are related. It's a theoretical question, but it's also something very concrete. So my intention eventually is to focus more on some of the ways in which houses speak their own truths, that is, the ways they express, but also engage with their complex histories, and with the relationships they have to themselves and to elsewheres and others. And I will do that towards the second part, or the third part of the talk, by focusing on the biography of a particular house located in one of the older working class, high density townships. We talk about townships in Southern Africa, on the outskirts of Bulawayo, which is Zimbabwe's second city. And you'll hear more about this house a little bit later. But for some time, I've been convinced that pursuing a biographical approach to buildings, and more generally, and not least of all to houses, combined with more familiar anthropological methods, I mean, I'm sure people have been doing this as well, but architects have been doing it as well. But so combining these biographical approaches with the more familiar anthropological methods, ethnographic methods, but still keeping this ear and this eye on the bigger structural questions as well, offers a valuable way to look at the relationship between property and citizenship, more broadly, and property and personhood specifically. So I'm hoping to convince you of that by the time I'm done. So what I'll do in these next 40-50 minutes, I'll start with a brief background to the work that has actually brought me to thinking about the biography of a building and to this property-personhood relationship. Sort of seems a little like it's become a bit of a compulsion when I look back retrospectively, but it wasn't the intention to always look at it. It just seems to have been there sort of along the way. So then I'll follow that by talking a little bit about how I understand the notions of property and personhood, or by way of a sort of conceptual compass a little bit. And then want to talk more about biography of a building as a form of methodology. I mean, you might come back and tell me it doesn't constitute methodology, it constitutes an approach or a framework, but I would really be interested in how you see it as methodology. And then in the remainder, I would like to talk more substantively about this biographical dimensions of the house 1199 Bekazi Road, Old Luveve, Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. I will come back to that. I've known this house for 4 decades, and it's a very important place for me. But let me start rather with talking about my work and how it's consistently been attentive in some way to varied and shifting relationships of people to property. And here, for example, I've done both rural and urban work. In the rural, it's been around land, physical agricultural land, residential plots. In the urban, it's mainly been around houses rather than buildings, although I'll come back to the building part as well. So through this, I've looked at the relationship between, especially property, citizenship, and the state. I've been very, very drawn to the state in all these stories, but it seems increasingly I begin to focus more on property and personhood. And often it's been explored in contexts of disruption, of crisis, among dislocated, as Till sort of indicated, around displacement, dislocated, and often illegalized residents of either rural or urban peripheries. So, for example, my doctoral research over 20 years ago explored the violent eviction of rural small-scale farmers on the agrarian margins in Zimbabwe, and how a rural local authority violently evicted several hundred families from a sort of edge between a national park and a communal land, burned down people's granaries, turned them into, they criminalized them, sort of illegalized them by redefining them as squatters. They were migrant farmers, they were redefined as squatters. And this generated a sort of legitimization for evicting them. So they were then dumped on the side of the road, some 40 kilometers away, with whatever they could salvage from this bulldozing and burning of their houses. A year later, when my field work began, these evictees and now returnees had managed to come back home, and during the visits and the interviews at their homesteads, some of the families made a point of bringing out bags of burnt mealie cobs, maize cobs, and burnt clothes and burnt pots. So they would store them at the side. They didn't throw them away. They kept them as evidence of what had happened. And as I say here, the still pungent scent of smoke forcefully underscored the violence of their removal and the precariousness of their return. So already, 20 years ago, I was very interested in people's relationships to their place, their property, their belonging, their personhood, and how that was so disruptive. A subsequent research project in the early to mid-2000s examined the reluctant migration of now evicted white Zimbabwean commercial farmers across the border to Mozambique, and their ambivalent yet determined efforts to, as they said, become Mozambicanized and find a new foothold for their lives and livelihoods under really precarious conditions. Moving to Mozambique did not just make everything okay. During my research with these displaced farming families in Manica province in western Mozambique, amongst many other things I was looking at, I was really struck by the way the houses, they kind of tried to reconstitute order in the way they put their houses together. And so both this fantasy of an ordered past that had been disrupted by the mass land invasions and evictions, but also the sense that Mozambique had always been seen as chaotic and disordered. And to keep away this danger of sort of losing their own standards, it was very important in how they constructed their homes and their gardens. In more recent years, my work has focused on urban displacement and resettlement in and around Zimbabwe's second city, Bulawayo, in the context of extreme and chronic political and economic crisis in Zimbabwe since 2000. So specifically, I've examined a quite rare, I forgot to mention, switch off one's phones. So I've really been working over the last 7 years on quite a rare case of former long-term squatters who'd been around the periphery, actually quite close to the centre of Bulawayo, and who were unusually given plots and houses, admittedly quite far out of the city, but it's very rare to have squatters given houses. And it came about through the squatters themselves, NGOs, churches, pressurizing the Bulawayo City Council, but also the International Organization for Migration coming in at that time, during a time of mass urban displacement in Zimbabwe, 2005-06, you may know of it. And IOM offering to build houses for about 200 squatter families. Very, very unusual. Bulawayo City Council found the plots, And I've looked at, I mean, that's not what I'm going to talk about very much today, but I've looked at what I call the paradoxes of property citizenship. So people actually getting access to property and to legality, legal lives for the first time maybe ever, but at the same time in a condition of chronic impoverishment, distance from Bulawayo, so they were now even further away from livelihoods, not having the ID documents that would then allow them to formalize the promise of this property. But even so, this notion of owning one's own house, and they would own them, they would have the right with the right documents to get a 99-year leasehold. So this very profound shift in the sense of being and selfhood and personhood, you could say. So I've done, a lot of my work has been around that. But as already noted, in approaching all these contexts which have sort of resonances with each other, I've always worked with a relational sensibility in trying to unfold the interconnectedness between the different dimensions of sociological worlds. So this is meant, for example, focusing on multiply positioned actors across multiple sites, scales, temporalities. I've been drawn consistently to the connections and disconnections that mark the relationships between these broader structural and often transnational conditions and processes, and on the other hand, the more intimately lived as well, experiences of everyday life in given places. So that kind of sets a little bit of the scene of how I come to, or have been on the journey towards thinking about this biographies of buildings and property and personhood. But let me say a little bit now about some ideas about property. In the introduction to their edited volume entitled Changing Properties of Property, von Bende-Beckmann et al. Described property as that which, and I quote, concerns the organization and legitimation of rights and obligations with respect to goods that are regarded as valuable. Not unusual. Similarly, economic anthropologists Bill Maurer and Gabriel Schwab note that when something becomes formalized as property, be this an object, an idea, a building, a body, with either individual or collective rights of ownership attached to it, it becomes alienable, that is, capable of being sold or transferred. In other words, it becomes a commodity or commodifiable. So becoming property establishes a relational value of one thing relative to another, and in some cases in relation to a market, not always. But as many scholars have noted, property is clearly relational in a non-economic sense too. Property relations are embedded in other social relations, and this gives it symbolic and emotional as well as material or market value. Inevitably then, almost everywhere property is contested. Those who have rights to own or use certain things, resources, spaces, have them in relation to other rights of other people. So, in other words, we need to think of property not simply in terms of a single relationship, but think of it and think of ownership itself in terms of wider property systems or regimes with their own property rules, norms, terms of ownership and negotiation. Maurer and Schwab are convinced that there's a changing arithmetic, as they call it, of self and ownership in our contemporary world of what they call accelerating privatization and globalization. And they're speaking from the global north, I would say. So this is reflected in the title of their volume, which is Acceleration Possession, Global Futures of Property and Personhood, in which the various dimensions that constitute personhood, they suggest, are increasingly being, quote, brought within the ambit of the capitalist marketplace. However, in my view, such a sweeping claim clearly needs to be more contextualized and nuanced. Also, such overstatement, in the way that I see it, tends to underplay some of the more personal, more intimate dimensions and dynamics and diversity of ordinary people's relationships to property and personhood. I mean, yes, one can look at these global trends of acute privatization, but I think seeing it only from that grand perspective tends to miss a lot of lot else that's going on, maybe going on simultaneously. But going back to the generally agreed argument that property rights are as much social, cultural, and political relationships as they are legal or economic, while such insights and perspectives are more often associated with a generic Africa or other seemingly exoticized places, interestingly, writing in the Stanford Law Review in 1982, American legal scholar Margaret Rowden refers to what she terms the personhood perspective, being used in legal disputes over property rights in the USA. Here I think she captures something seemingly fundamental about the close relationship between property and personhood. I have to actually just turn and read it this way because I'm too small on the screen. So she says, most people possess certain objects they feel are almost part of themselves. These objects are closely bound up with personhood because they're part of the way we constitute ourselves as continuing personal entities in the world. They may be as different as people are different, but some common examples might be a wedding ring, a portrait, an heirloom, or a house. From a different perspective, John Berger offers a cautionary note. While people believe in property, he writes, in essence, they only believe in the illusion of protection which property gives. Undoubtedly, there's much evidence of so-called property rights and the promise of property being far from certain or secure in practice. Millions of those evicted and displaced across the world can attest to this. Yet in a relatively stable situation, or even in certain kinds of crisis settings, such a belief is both powerful and meaningful as a form of what one might call anticipatory investment with important social and moral and practical effects. Certainly that's been the case in the post-displacement resettlement site I mentioned previously, working on the periphery of Bulawayo. So for many squatters who had lived illegally, as I said, most of their lives, the houses provided to them by International Organization for Migration on plots offered by the City Council promised the possibility of propertied citizenship, and with this the chance to transition to a more autonomous and undoubtedly more decent and dignified form of life and personhood. Gogo Boso is the name of the woman there, and this is her house in Mazwi, the area. This is, her life and her relationship to her new place. This is currently the backdoor kitchen, the backyard kitchen, but is actually the material of her former home. So that transition was quite radical. But it's there also, well, she uses it, but it's also a reminder of the transformation for her. So this feeling of becoming what she called becoming a proper person was sustained even while the move to this resettlement site for these several hundred households brought with it other forms of uncertainty and impoverishment. As I said, partly due to the distance from Bulawayo and no cash community, literally not having a $1 to take the transport into town. No livelihood options, continually declining economy, and as I said, the ID documents that prevented the full realization so far of many becoming actually property. So that was my way of just talking about some thoughts on property. But now just to say something more about personhood. Scholars, especially anthropologists, are generally aware of the academic debates around the varied and competing conceptualizations and interpretations of personhood. I certainly am not going to go into any extensive discussion here. But as Maurer and Schwab note, there is, for example, an ever-present tension between post-Enlightenment Western liberal notions of personhood and African collective notions. For the former, this is familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. For the former, the person is, or the self, is largely defined by ideas of human dignity, of being valued in terms of individual autonomy, independence, freedom, and equality. As James Ferguson reminds us, though, there are also post-colonial ideas and ideals of liberation of both individuals and collectivities. Liberation from tyranny, colonialism, from forms of racism or patriarchal domination. So these both differ from but also embrace some of the liberal Western notions of personhood. So it's a complex, moving sort of definitions. But countering the sort of Euro-American, to use the Comaroffs term, the Euro-American sort of version from at least one location in the global south, the Comaroffs argue that African notions of personhood are, quote, infinitely more complicated than the universalising, singularising, teleological Euro-American version of the autonomous individual. They note further that, quote, the continent, as diverse as it is large, has spawned alternative modernities in which very different notions of selfhood, civility, and publicity have taken root. So such diversity across both space and time, I suggest, raises important questions about the situatedness and the contingency of what affords people a sense of dignity and selfhood in life. So I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Fiona Ross, anthropologist in South Africa, Cape Town, yeah. So I draw a little bit on her work in an informal settlement on the outskirts of Cape Town that some have called, it's called the park. It was the bush. People moved from the bush to the park, ironically called that. Others have called it a squalid shanty town. So she focuses to a large extent on the relationship between decency, the Afrikaans word ordentlicher, I'm saying it like a Dane now, and housing, examining the everyday making and unmaking of personhood within this post-apartheid squatter community. Among the many conversations Ross records in her wonderful 2010 book, the following took place between two neighbours in the park, Janine and Wilma. In response to a question Janine posed to Wilma about why she preferred to keep her nephew from Port Elizabeth from visiting her, Wilma replied as follows. I'm not going to do it in the right accent, but you should hear that voice. I don't really want my real family to visit, she says. You know, they do visit me and no one's ever had a problem, but whenever I go home, my sister would say, oh no, you're obsessed with that shack of yours. But it's a house, it's my home. It might be a shack, but it's my home and I'm proud of it. When I asked her where her house is, she couldn't answer me. But it's true, I love my shack, but they can't seem to understand that. Look, when I left home, I also didn't understand because I grew up in a brick house. Wilma is conscious of being a shack dweller and how that is viewed through a moralizing lens, something she herself had obviously internalized previously before this became her own reality, and she viewed it with different eyes. Through the intimacies of Ross's sustained ethnographic work that looks at both the idea and the lived experiences of certain kinds of houses in a historically deeply racialized, classed and gendered context, she helps us to understand the complicated relationships people have to both themselves and to their kin and community. That's by way of some thoughts on property and personhood more broadly. But then I want to move now to this reflections on the biography of a building. I've called it Biography of a Building as a methodological possibility. And I'm asking for feedback on this. For some time, I've been exploring the possibilities of an approach I broadly termed the biography of a building. And it began with a personal experience, not of a house actually, but of spending a lot of dark days in the Harare passport office, getting my passport renewed, both in 2012 and in 2017. It runs out because of all the visas you have to get stamped in it. So this Harare passport office is in a set of low-lying buildings called Makombi buildings. I know that set of buildings from a long time ago. But so while in the course, especially in 2012, this is where it began, I was spending these long hours in very Kafkaesque-like corridors, dark, broken tiles on the ground, lights not working, electricity often going out, people shuffling around, little photographs dropped on the floor, this kind of, and this really appalling treatment by people working there, this sort of arrogant, really dismissive treatment. So in the midst of all this, I of course, I knew that I'd known those buildings, but I was really struck by the fact that 30 years previously, I had been an employee, not of the Passport Office, not at that time, but of the Ministry of Women's Affairs and Community Development. The very same building complex, 30 years before, immaculately clean, the registry office with these perfectly maintained files, bureaucratic trolleys coming to deliver tea at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., etc., etc. So this order, this, and the sense of public service, which is very profound. And so began this reflection to me of how does one think about the biography of a building and the biography of a state simultaneously. Of course, I was inside that story because I was familiar with both, actually. So that was a sort of origin story of trying to think about this notion of the biography of a building. Just on a sideline, other work that has inspired me includes, for example, the work of Danny Hoffman. I don't know if people know it, Monrovia Modern, where he's talking about these four iconic buildings, sort of ruins, actually. I mean, not completely rubble, but ruined buildings, these iconic modernist buildings in Monrovia, looking at their material forms and the relationships that these buildings have to those who temporarily occupied, guarded, or then were evicted from them. And using this as a way to examine the relationship between the building, or the built environment, as he calls it, and political imagination. So, using buildings in this very engaged sort of conversation between life, intimate life, political life, social life, and structures, and what structures them. So since 2012 and onwards, I've continued to think about, and to some extent, try and test out various biographical techniques, you could say, in relation to buildings, while continually asking myself what insights such an approach can offer. This particular question does remain open. It's an ongoing exploration. However, for me, it's clear that using my own personal relationship to a particular building has been an instructive starting point, which necessarily also weaves together parts of my own biography with that of the buildings themselves. And in an anthropological environment, nobody's going to say, you can't do that. I think one can, and I have anyway. But obviously what it ensures, what it compels actually, is a level of intimacy, much in line with Fiona Ross's proposition that anthropological knowledge indeed, quote, demands a kind of intimacy. Yet while I would clearly argue that intimate engagement of a kind, or going in close, as John Berger encourages, is a key aspect of the biographical method, it isn't necessarily predicated on having one's own pre-existing familiarity with a given building. So, going in close, an intimate engagement with it, yes, but one doesn't have to know it already. But practically speaking, what then does this mean methodologically? As far as possible, as already implied, it entails a researcher's or a biographer's physical presence and experience in relationship to the building, allowing for real-time ethnographic encounters with a space and its multiple textures and dynamics, anthropological and architectural and historical, you would say. And since buildings both hide and reveal, one needs to be attentive both to those aspects that are more immediately visible and accessible, and those that lie beneath the surfaces. So with regard to a house in particular, treating it simultaneously biographically and ethnographically as the subject of investigation in itself requires using all one's senses and sensitivities and sensibilities. It requires paying attention to the oral as well as visual signs of how the house speaks, noting both its multi-layered physical, social, and personal narratives and its wider historical, spatial, and structural context. But in terms of working with the building or house itself and reiterating some earlier points, each situated structure requires attention to several different dimensions. And here's by way of a list. So, space and location. So for example, what kind of neighborhood is the house situated in? What is the history and the establishment and emergence of a neighborhood? What do the streets look like? Who are the neighbors and so on? Exterior materialities of the house itself. What structural form does it take? What materials is it built from? What constitutes its exterior? Is it walls? Is it, wooden? What doors, windows? What's in the yard? What kind of gate? How large or small? What number of sized rooms? And so on. The interior materialities are, already as implied, what is on the walls? Are they plastered, painted, exposed, cracked? What hangs on the walls? Religious symbols, paintings, photographs. What's the floor made of? Stone, wood, cement, thatch. What kind of furniture or equipment, and how are these arranged? What kinds of windows, and are there curtains or not? How does one create privacy? Are the rooms bare or full of things, full of people? Sensory dimensions, as I noted before. What smells, what sounds dominate the house at different times of the day? What kind of lighting is used? What kind of heating at different times of the year? Obviously the occupants, if there are occupants. Who are its residents? Who owns and occupies? For how long? How are the residents differentiated among them? How is the space used for living, for livelihoods, for prayer? A meeting place. Atmosphere and emotion. A house is inevitably a space of both the ordinary and the extraordinary. A place that facilitates the everyday making or unmaking of life. Simultaneously a space of hopes and dreams, of wounds, mourning, healing. Spaces that are always in motion and sometimes in commotion, always undergoing change. Temporalities. The house as a space simultaneously of the past, the present, the future, of different temporal rhythms in respect to its different occupants. Okay, so they're kind of pointers, not a formal checklist, but ways to remind oneself of things to pay attention to. And it's not that, in what I'm going to talk about next, or even in the work that I've been doing, that I've gone in with my checklist and said, what's here, what's here, what's here. In a way, this checklist has sort of evolved as I've understood my relationship to these spaces, as I've spent time, as I've written a little bit, as I've reflected a little bit. So it's an emerging, evolving sort of framework, you could say. But as time passes, I see these and others as valuable foundations for undertaking, you could say, ethnobiographic research on houses, both in themselves, in the spirit of open discovery, but also in helping to deepen some sense of relationships between people and property. And I say more, one could also say between people and place, but it's the property, it's the building, it's the ownership, not ownership, it's the entitlements, not entitlements, and the dynamics amongst people in those particular spaces. Okay. So those are framings of various kinds, but what I now want to do is turn to, as far as I can, in a short time, the biography of 1199 Bakazi Road. As I said, it's in Old Leveve, one of the suburb townships outside of Bulawayo. These are the western suburbs in Bulawayo. Anybody knows Zimbabwe? I don't know, but Bulawayo has, a whole lot of townships from 2 kilometers right close to Bulawayo, spent, 5, 10, 20 kilometers out. So these were, it's one of these slightly older ones. I've just got one picture. It's in 1968, and actually, the house that I'm going to talk about isn't quite as big as that. Those were sort of more family housing. This is just one shot of one of the little business centres in Leveve, as it is quite recently. Closed up, actually. Could have been because there is nothing in the shops to buy often in Zimbabwe's crisis. Nonetheless, this house that I'm going to tell you about has been part of my life for over 40 years. It continues to be important to me and is in fact the only house that has remained constant in my own life over 4 decades of recurring migration. A backstory, starting in the late 1970s. I've got a photograph that I want to skip to. I put it in the wrong order, but I'm going to skip to it. Initially, this house stood as a distant, unreachable place I had never seen, but constantly imagined, and which underscored a painful separation in early 1977 that would last for 6 years from Sophie Mogwagwa, what I call my invisible mother, as opposed to my recognized biological mother. I'll go back to that photograph of 2 mothers. Okay, you've seen that now, I'll go back to that. The house had been bought for Sophie by my biological parents, who I'll just call my parents for now, in lieu of a pension, following the difficult decision they made to leave Zimbabwe, which was still Rhodesia, in 1977, taking a reluctant 17-year-old, as I was then, with them, and ending 16 years of a very close relationship with Sophie. Sophie's relationship with our family had started in 1960 in a similar way to that of other young rural women coming to town to seek work and a future. She'd been born in rural Mberengwa in the middle of Zimbabwe in 1927. When she came to then Salisbury, she was in her early 30s and had been rejected by her husband for giving birth to a stillborn child. She never had subsequent children. With some schooling, she was in a fairly good position to secure domestic work in what was then the height of settler colonialism in the then Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. She found such work with my family just a year after I was born, and our lifelong bond was set from then on. It's a little, you can hear, but emotional. It would be 5 years later that Zimbabwe would declare, or it wasn't Zimbabwe, then it was still Rhodesia, the Federation had broken up in 1964. In 1965, the 11th of November, the Rhodesian Front minority white party led by Ian Smith declared illegal independence from Britain. And that would precipitate the national liberation struggle that began around 1966 and ended with Zimbabwe's majority rule independence in April 1980. Very condensed story there. We're not going to focus on that. As a white, just going back again, as a white middle-class family living in a low-density suburb, with a big garden and so on, close to the university where my mother worked, in then Salisbury, now Harare, the property was fairly typical for its time. The larger house had spacious living and sleeping rooms, while at the back, so to speak, were the euphemistically called domestic quarters. A number of single rooms for each of several workers and shared ablution facilities. It was in Sophie's room that I spent a great deal of my childhood, my early childhood. I would sit on the cool, dark, polished stone floor of her room, drawing or playing jacks, aware of the curved metal feet of her bed resting on bricks a few inches off the floor. We'd sing Ndebele songs or listen to the radio while she crocheted or read her Bible. We'd drink hot, sweet, milky tea and eat salsa together. This is where I felt most at home. Sophie was the person I was emotionally closest to and most committed to up until her death in 2008. We cared for each other in our different ways, in different eras of our lives. I considered her my real mother. She had no biological children of her own, and unquestioningly, we belonged to one another. In a sense, though, it was an illicit relationship, one that my instincts as a child compelled me to keep hidden in terms of the extent of our mutual love and devotion that competed with that of my visible biological family. So when my parents decided to leave Zimbabwe in 1977, Sophie and I had no parent-child rights, no recognized entitlement to make claims on or for one another. So the separation was excruciating for us both. But we weathered it for the 6 years I was away, until finally I could return to post-independent Zimbabwe in 1983 as a graduate, and I was able to find a job in the Ministry of Community Development and Women's Affairs in Makombi buildings. In the meantime, through acquiring a house as a single woman by then in her early 50s, Sophie transitioned structurally to becoming an independent, propertied urban citizen, from having been the occupant of a small room at the back of my parents' house, taking care of a white family. Even if it was a loving, respectful, and progressive family, entirely opposed to white minority rule, the structuring of relationships was inevitably already partially shaped by a wider history of colonially defined racialized inequality. But the fact of her owning her own house in Leveve provided her with a profound sense of control and authority over her own life, subject to no one, at least not in an everyday sense. Of course, as a devout Methodist, active in her church, you might have suggested she was always subject to God's authority. But she had no husband and was at a safe distance from the patriarchal structures of her rural family in Mpumalanga. Until now to the 1980s, when at last I returned to newly independent Zimbabwe, I was finally able to visit Sophie in Old Leveve and stay with her in her own home, just as she would visit me in mine when I eventually got one. Finally, I was able to get to know the house I had so sorely missed. The house with a metal gate. With 11, that number has always been in my brain. The house with a lemon tree in the front yard and with green chimolio growing in neat rows in the backyard, used to make it a relish with the sadza cooked in a thick black pot on the small stove in the kitchen. I want to remember those early sensations of homecoming. I closed my eyes to see better. In a low glass cabinet along one wall in your small sitting room, there is a brown pottery casserole dish I recognize. As a child, my mother used to serve lamb curry in it regularly on Sunday nights to a group of close family friends. It was among the household objects given to you when we left. Now, you take it out on special occasions, including when I visit, and serve your own delicious beef stew. On the floor, beneath a familiar coffee table, is a slightly worn Chinese silk carpet my grandparents had brought back for us from a trip they made to Hong Kong in the mid-60s. Our histories merge here. Two small brown sofas meet at right angles against the walls. One of the walls is painted a light turquoise blue, a colour I will always associate with you. There are crocheted white cotton doilies resting over the backs and arms of the sofas. In a drawer in my apartment in Copenhagen, I have carefully preserved similar white cotton doilies you crocheted and would bring as gifts to me when you visited me in Harare. I bring them out on special occasions too, when I want to remember your strong hands holding mine, or digging into my arms as you hugged me in welcome or farewell. Opposite the turquoise wall is a cream wall which has photographs pinned closely together in a large frame. Some are studio photos of you dressed in your finest. Others are of my siblings and I sent from long distances. There were some additional exterior, going back to the house now itself, there were some additional exterior rooms on the outside of this house where Sophie was able to rent them out to tenants. This helped with the payment of rates and rent. I was in Zimbabwe during most of the 1980s when I was in Harare, she was in Bulawayo. At the time, Sophie would travel to sell clothes she had made in parts of rural Matabele land. But it was also a time, very strange time in Zimbabwe. The 1980s were called the development decade. But at the same time, there were these massacres going on in Matabele land, in rural Matabele land, by Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF, trained army actually, the 5th Brigade. So Sophie would be going into these districts in Matabele land, selling clothes that she'd sewn, and would be coming back to Bulawayo. And in this period, actually very little information was coming to the rest of the country, and people were profoundly intimidated and afraid even to speak in Ndebele, because it was aimed at Ndebele speakers. And so even in the house itself, there was this, she was bilingual, Ndebele and Shona speaking in terms of her family origins, but there would be this, even in the heartland of Bulawayo, of Ndebele and Matabele land, there would be this preference to talk Shona in the house and to, you know, maintain some sort of distance, but also some silences around the things that couldn't be said about Matabele land. This notion that the walls of the house had ears. The night there was a unity accord, that violence came to an end in the late 1980s, and there was a unity accord and a co-opting of ZAPU, the Ndebele-based, or the Matabele land-based party. But the 1990s now was the house, you know, life in the house continued. But the house was big enough for Sophie herself and spacious to accommodate a small child who was to come to her from her extended family in Mbarengwa around 1989 and stay with her for close to 20 years. The child, called Kudzai, also born in Mbarengwa in 1985, was given to Sophie at the age of 4 by Sophie's older rural-based polygamous brother. Never mind the wife of that man, but it was a decision in rural, I mean, there were a lot of children, there was a decision to both to give Sophie a companion and a child to raise, but also to give this child the opportunity for education and so on. So Kudzai would be Sophie's charge for her to raise and take care of, and who would eventually take care of her. Sophie sent Kudzai to school, and although she could be somewhat strict at times, they would become very close and devoted to one another. In turn, Kudzai would become my given sister, much younger given sister. The energy of the house inevitably changed with a child in it, but in any case, it was always a place of welcome, of lively conversation with Sophie's neighbors or close friends or family. Things changed again in the 2000s. Kudzai would come into her late teenagehood and early 20s in the 2000s, when Zimbabwe's political and economic crisis constantly escalated. Things would get desperate for everyone. Tenants could barely pay their rent, and cash, food, and jobs were scarce everywhere. With my help, Sophie managed to keep paying the rates and bills. She could no longer travel into rural areas. She was also much older, but also it was a period of violent rural invasions and political violence in the rural areas. So there was a different dynamic in the house. Also Kudzai, who wanted to do nursing, this is a time where ZANU-PF, Mugabe's party, was controlling access to higher education, and one was forced as a young person to attend a youth training center, part of it training youth militia. The stories of rape were horrific, so knowing that Kudzai was actually going to one of these as a gateway to try and get education was actually terrifying. Thankfully, in Matabele land, it wasn't as bad as in other parts of the country, so she came out fairly unscathed from that. But you can imagine the tensions and the concerns and the worries that were around the house. In early 2008, at the height of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, in the trillions of %, also major political violence around elections. Just before that, Sophie became desperately ill. I wasn't living in Zimbabwe then. I was coming annually. But on my last visits to see her, I talked about the importance of her making a formal written will so as to leave the house to Kudzai. This she did, with close friends and neighbours acting as witnesses at the magistrate's court, which spared Kudzai from being evicted by relatives feeling more entitled to the house than she. So indeed, at Sophie's death in April 2008, at the age of 81, the house became Kudzai's when she was only 23. The relatives did come to bury and mourn Sophie, and in some ways to collect their due. They would not get the house that was legally secured for Kudzai. But in anticipation, in the last weeks of her life, Sophie had carefully, meticulously planned the distribution of money, clothes, cooking pots, and other household possessions to key individuals, relatives. It was an odd sensation the first time I visited the house after her death. Much of the furniture and the things I'd been so familiar with for decades were no longer there. They'd been distributed. But since then, Kudzai has gradually made the space her own, together with her husband and growing family. Into the 2010s, Kudzai is now 34, has a husband and 3 children. She never managed to get to nursing, but she did manage to complete a diploma in early childhood learning from the Bulawayo Teachers College. But soon after graduating, she was compelled to accept the only work available as an ECL teacher, and that was in deep rural Nkai, almost a day's journey from Bulawayo. She can come home about once a month and during school holidays, but the rest of the time her children, one of whom is under 3, are taken care of by her husband, who drives a taxi on the night shift, and by a young domestic worker. This hasn't been easy on any of the family members, and the marriage has become strained. So all this partly speaks to the reality of any house as a site of ever-changing, complex family dynamics, echoing generational life cycles, alongside the shifting and increasingly unpredictable fates of Zimbabweans more generally. On one of my trips home to Zimbabwe in April 2017, I videoed an interview with Kudzai. I tried to put clips in, but the volume didn't work. I would have really loved you to see her talking. Asking her about her relationship to the house and what it meant to her. Her responses were very emotional, as were mine, tinged with the shared memories of our given mother, Sophie. This house, she said, the relationship that we have, I don't know how to explain it. It's where all my memories are buried. This is the only home that I've known. I grew up here for as long as I can remember. I have great attachment to this house. To me, home means a place that gives you comfort, a place that you find happiness, a place that you know that you feel free to be, that you can express even your feelings, everything. Being able to do what you want, yes, freely. I asked her what it meant to actually own the house. To me, it means so much, so much, she replied. I have a place to live with my kids. I don't even know how I can express what it means to me. I felt so honored to get the house. Without Sophie leaving the house to me, I don't think I would have anything. She left me a place to stay. She always said that one day when I'm gone, you'll have the house. It means you can support your children, and that's exactly what happened. Even if I face some challenges, I don't have to worry about a place to stay. So Kudzai's responses speak pointedly to notions of autonomy, freedom, security, and a sense of the future through her children that she would not otherwise have been able to imagine without owning the house. But of course, this is not, as I said before, a simple equation. There are the constant exigencies of life, not least in crisis-ridden Zimbabwe, of having to live far from her 3 children and her husband, of trying to make ends meet in crisis-ridden Zimbabwe, of dealing with what Fiona Ross, I turn to her again, calls the improvisational quality of social relations in the making and sustaining of familial and household relationships. So, as mentioned, this has not run smoothly in recent years. But in the end, she has the house. It's in her name. It will carry her and her children into the future with at least some level of stability and certainty, no matter what. It is also deeply important to me that the house remains secure for her, and in turn remains a stable presence in my own life. It is a key to my internal compass. I was going to say a few other things, but I think that's where I'd like to end. Thanks very much.